Oh yeah.
Subscribe to StevensvilleGamers, my dudes.
Episode of Fred's Magic Hour. Now here, today, we're here to discuss 5 things you need to know about Zendikar Rising Limited. So I'm going to check on my stream real quick, make sure that I am sounding okay before we jump into the episode. Yep, I'm sounding okay. Alright, so I am very excited to bring this to you. This show is intended, or this episode is just intended to give you a few strategies to use during your Zendikar Rising limited experience, be that draft or sealed, and I'll specify with each tip. This will make you a better drafter, a better sealed player, a better parent, and a better person. So let's jump right into it. Let's see what are the 5 things you need to know about Zendikar Rising Limited. These are sort of gathered over the few drafts that I've done, the little sealed that I've done. This set is tricky to evaluate, and I want to give you some help on evaluating it. I want to show you the things that I've learned that sort of can get you over some of the humps that are present in Zendikar Rising Limited. So let's jump right into it. Number 1 is evaluating spell lands. Now, these got a lot of weird looks at the start of the reveal season, and for good reason. They're confusing cards. They're hard to evaluate. They have a spell on one side that's typically not something that's good enough that you'd want to play it in a limited deck, but on the other side they've got a land that can tap for the color that spell is, that comes in tapped. So I put 2 cards over here that are like kind of the comparison I want to make. So Zoff Consumption is not very good. You would absolutely never play that spell if it did not have a land on the back. Skyclave Cleric, you probably would. It'd be a decent common. You would probably play that as a 2-drop. 1/3 that gains you 2 life for 2. You'd play that even if it didn't have a land on the back. And it's really tricky to decide not only like when do I pick these in draft, which that is still kind of up for debate, but also if I pull these in sealed, do I play them in my deck? Do they make me want to play those colors? They don't. Where I've landed on them, this is my opinion, is that you do not want to play a color just because you have a lot of these spell lands in it. But in sealed, you play every spell land you have in your colors, even if it is not a good spell on the other side, even if it's like Begin Veil, like the really bad blue one. You play all of them, and you put them in the land slot in your deck. You do not count them as a spell aside from maybe Balaged Recovery or Skyclave Cleric. And the reason for that is that these are just lands that come in tapped that have a mode of a spell. Think of them like the Blighted lands from Battle for Zendikar block. It was a land with like a spell you could cast by sacking the land, basically. I want you to think of them like that, because you're going to be playing them as a land tapped a lot of the time, but sometimes you're going to draw them late in the game, you're not going to need another land, and you're going to have Zoff Consumption. You're going to get to drain your opponent for 4. So that's how you want to evaluate these spell lands. Evaluate them in a way that takes into account the fact that they are land first and a spell second. Put them in your land slot. If you're playing sealed and you have 4 spell lands in your colors, and you want to play 17 lands, play 13 other lands and those 4 spell lands, and then just fill the rest of your deck with spells. These let you play more spells in your deck without like reducing your consistency, because they can just be lands when you need them to. As for draft, that is a bit more complicated. I would put these in the same realm as, say, life lands, where like in sealed you're going to play every life land that's in your colors, or like cycling lands. But in draft, you don't pick them very high, because the value of the cards is in the opportunity cost of playing them, not in the actual like playing of the card itself. It's in the opportunity cost of putting it in your deck. So you will take these when there are no other options in your colors in the pack. Save cards like maybe, like I said, Skyclave Cleric or Balaged Revival, Balaged Regeneration, the green one that returns something from your graveyard to your hand. Those are the ones that you might take just by virtue of the spell on the other side being good. But you take them last, you take them late, but then you put all of them in your deck that you drafted that are in your colors, because they're really helpful. So yeah, hopefully that elucidates the purpose of spell lands to you a little bit. That was definitely one of the more confusing things about this limited format for me on day 1. So next we're going to talk about evaluating party cards. You look at these cards and they look really weak. They're either really weak or really strong, right? So it's hard to, when you're just drafting through, when you're picking these cards, evaluate how strong they're going to be in an actual game. So the removal in this format is pretty skewed toward black and red, more so than most other formats. White only has like one good piece of removal, and blue just has bouncing. And there's not even really good green fight spells. There's the 2-mana bite spell, so green does have a good piece of removal, but it's hard to tell how many other party creatures you're going to have on the field. So I think a good rule to consider is assume you will have one other party creature when you play a party card. So for the purposes of this Thundering Spark Mage, go ahead and assume you've got a warrior out. Don't assume anymore, don't even think about it anymore. Don't think about, well, this might deal 3 damage. Just think about, this is a 4-mana 2/2. When it comes in, it's going to deal 2 damage. Is that good enough? And decide from there whether you want to play the card. Veteran Adventurer, assume it's going to cost 1 less. Assume it's going to be a 5-mana 5/5 Vigilance that fills your party. Is that worth playing? I would say usually yes in Limited. You would be very happy with a 5-mana 5/5 Vigilance, so I think that passes the test. Cascade Seer, 4-mana 3/3 enters battlefield, scry 2. That's a pretty good 4-drop. Yeah, I'd play that. It is easy to get caught up in, oh my gosh, I can make my Veteran Adventurer cost 2 mana. It can be a 2-mana 5/5 Vigilance. I'm going to let you in a little secret. In Limited, it's never going to be a 2-mana 5/5 Vigilance. Thundering Spark Mage is never going to come in and do 4 to something. Cascade Seer is never going to come in and scry you 4. It's not good to even hope for 3 because you want to be evaluating these cards pragmatically. This set is one that is very likely to take you to Magical Christmas Land when you're thinking about what your cards are going to do together and the combinations that they're going to make. And so that is a trap that is vitally important not to fall into, with this set in particular, but with a lot of sets, Limited formats. And Party is one of those mechanics that can take you to Magical Christmas Land if you only evaluate your cards assuming that you're going to have a Cleric, a Rogue, a Warrior, and a Wizard out. So yeah, I would advocate for evaluating party cards as if X is going to equal 2, right? As if you're going to have the party member that you already have, and then this card. And of course, I neglected to mention on accident, there are some spells that count your party. Assume that you have 1 party member when you cast those. The 5-mana, look at the top, X, put 3 in your hand, X plus 3, put 3 in your hand. So like the more party creatures you have, the more card selection you'll get. Assume you get to look at the top 4 and put 3 in. So yeah, those are party cards, which are kind of hard to evaluate, so I hope that was helpful. Next we're going to move on to put one of these in every deck. Now this is an easy tip. There have been some Limited formats where just the 1-mana equipment that equips for 1 that gives something flying has not been super viable, but most Limited formats you do want to play 1. This card, it turns out, is better. You're usually only equipping those kinds of things when you don't have much else to do with your turn anyway, so the equip cost being higher is less of a burden than... it more than makes up for, or it's more than made up for by it equipping for free when it comes in. So think about like lines of play where on turn 2 you're playing your 2-drop. On turn 3 you've got another 2-drop and you've got a Cliffhaven Kite Sail to put on your first 2-drop so you can swing through. Think about you play your big guy later and you equip this to it for 2. Yeah, Cliffhaven Kite Sail is a must. You don't want 2 out at a time. That generally is pretty bad because it's giving up 2 cards you could have played. And this is mostly for clearing up gummed up board states. You put it on your biggest creature and you start swinging in the air because the ground is too jammed up with little creatures that could block it out. So yeah, but Cliffhaven Kite Sail should go in pretty much every deck. In Limited, your deck's going to be full of creatures. Cliffhaven Kite Sail gives them flying. Bit of a no-brainer. As for where that means you should pick it in draft, that is a little bit more complicated. If by halfway through pack 2 you don't have one of these, you should be heavily prioritizing it. But if you can manage to grab it up most of the way through pack 1, don't think about it anymore. You've got your Cliffhaven Kite Sail, you can pass the rest of them. But yeah, Cliffhaven Kite Sail, great card. You should put one of them in every deck. It's an all-star in this Limited format for a common. You just don't want to have more than 1. So, the next thing I want to talk about is evaluating kicker cards. Pick a mode to evaluate a kicker card in. And what I mean by that is when you're looking at a kicker card, decide which half of the card you are excited about casting, you think is the best to cast, and then evaluate the card as if the other one were not an option, right? And this will help you get a very unbiased look at a kicker card. It will help you cut through the sort of, it'll help you cut through the question of how valuable is having this other mode. So I've chosen two what I consider to be kind of opposite cards in this respect here. So I picked Royal Eruption, which is a sorcery speed lightning strike, or if you pay 5 more, so 7, it's a sorcery speed 5 damage to any target. And I've chosen Into the Royal, which is 2 mana to bounce an online permanent, or you can kick it for 2 more mana, draw a card. So, Royal Eruption, I evaluate that as though the kicker did not exist. 5 more mana for 2 more damage is not very good, but I would play a sorcery speed lightning strike in almost any limited format because it's a removal spell or it's 3 to the dome. And in doing so, I can evaluate this card without overvaluing it by thinking, oh, well, I can deal 5 damage with this later in the game if I just hold on to it, because you're never going to want to hold on to it. One of the biggest traps that players fall into is in limited formats that have things like Kicker or Entwine, is they assume that they will be able to easily decide based on the stage of the game which mode they want on the kicker spell, and that's not exactly true. People hold spells they want to kick when they really don't need to, or cast spells early when they really shouldn't. So I put Into the Royal here as the opposite sort of thing. You never want to pay 2 mana to bounce an online permanent. You never want to play a spell that just bounces an online permanent. That's terrible. That's an awful thing to be doing with your turn. Ooh, I gotta sneeze. So you have to evaluate Into the Royal as just a 4 mana bounce a thing, draw a card. That I guess can sometimes just bounce a thing for 2, but you really never want to do that. And by taking these kicker cards and separating them into just the card that you want, so Sorcery Speed Lightning Strike or 4 mana Retroactive Remand, this is how you correctly evaluate kicker cards and avoid, avoid overvaluing the fact that they're 2 cards in one. Like, yes, obviously this is a little bit better than a Sorcery Speed Lightning Strike, and obviously the flexibility makes Into the Royal a little bit better than a 4 mana Retroactive Remand. But you have to evaluate these cards as though they are just one of the halves in order to avoid overvaluing the flexibility that Kicker provides. Excuse me, I'm sorry, I'm sneezing so much. Now on to the last, number 5, the last thing that I feel you need to know about Zendikar Rising Limited, and this one's a little bit easier to grasp. Build a spell with Landfall. Some people draft Landfall cards, thinking that, I'm going to play land every turn, so I'm going to get this effect every turn, and that's not exactly true. Sometimes late in the game you're going to be drawing one of your 2-drops, and then you've sort of built this Rube Goldberg device of landfall triggers that won't go off because you drew a 2 mana 2/2. So really what you should be trying to accomplish when you're drafting your landfall creatures or when you're building your sealed deck with a lot of landfall creatures is to build a spell with landfall. Make it so that late in the game, when you have several landfall creatures out, a land is giving you the value of a spell. So here I've got Fearless Fledgling, Dreadworm, Territorial Scythecat. These all help to accomplish this goal. I'm not saying play 3 colors in limited, you can play all 3 of these. But I'm saying, if you've got Fearless Fledgling, Makindi Ox, and the Vigilance Cat that puts a counter on itself every turn. Like, if you've got those out, then when you draw land in the late game, your land is basically a spell. It's a spell that puts a counter on 2 of your creatures and taps one of your opponents. And that's pretty great, honestly. So you should be looking at Landfall as a way to extend your plays into the late game and make you have a sort of a pseudo spell when you draw a land in the late game. Make it so that your turns where you're just top decking a land are advancing your game plan in some way. But do not think of these cards as self-sufficient individually or as though they'll trigger every turn. Don't think of Dreadworm as a 5 mana 5/4 indestructible on your turn. Don't think of Territorial Scythecat as a 2/1 trample that gets a counter every turn, because it's not going to every turn. But the point is to remember that a couple of landfall cards together add up to the value of a spell in the late game. So the value of them is making sure that your lands sort of turn into spells in a roundabout way in the late game. And that seems to be the role of landfall in this limited format. So, with that being said, I want to thank you guys for showing up for another episode of Fred's Magic Hour. I have been Fred, and I appreciate you. You're wonderful, and the world is a better place for having you in it. I hope to see you next week when I do another episode of Fred's Magic Hour. As usual, this is here on Stevensville Gamers. Big thank you to Stevensville Gamers for hosting us, and you can find my podcast, which I host with Aggressive Rhetoric, pretty much anywhere you find your podcast. YouTube, Apple Podcasts. It's called Gut Shot, and it's a Magic the Gathering sort of humor podcast. So we just kind of joke around about what's ruining Magic this week. And yeah, I hope you guys have a good day, and I will see you in a couple days with another episode of Fred's Magic Hour. Have a good one.